Hi everyone, this is Matthew from Matty's Custom Scale, and I thought what I would share with you now is actually what I think is one of the more fun parts of building a weathered car, and that's actually add the weathering. And so I've got a couple of pieces that I've worked on already, just to give a little bit of side-by-side comparison to show you what we're going to do now. So the previous sessions we've gone through how to actually get to this stage, which is all just paint. And then what we're going to try and do by the end of this session is get to this panel on the left hand side that looks a lot more tired and weathered, worn and rusty. And then I've got a couple of doors which I've sign written for the sake of the build theme, but you can see on the right hand side a nice fresh one, just paint. And then the left hand side is obviously a lot more worn out, and they're all very simple techniques, and I'll try to be as concise and explain them as possible, and at least share with you what I use to do these techniques. So some very basic things. Probably the most expensive part, and they're not very expensive, that I use are these MIG paints. So basically what the military guys use, one is fuel stains, then fresh engine oil, and then engine grime. So engine grime I use a fair bit, and that's what I'll probably start with once we get started. I also use Tamiya Weathering Master, snow, soot and rust. Fairly straightforward in how it works, so I haven't really used the snow much, but you can see the soot and the rust I've used quite a bit, and I'll show you how I use that. Again, very basic. I've always got some sandpaper, a couple of different grits handy, just as you're working it. You want to add a little bit of texture or some smudging on the rusty builds when it comes to stainless steel. I use a silver pen, doesn't need to be BMF and very highly reflective because it is a little bit worn out. This does need a little bit of time to dry, but I'll show you what that looks like. And then a Sharpie, and some of that is for some line writing or edging, and some of it is actually to create some smudging, so I'll see how much I can show you with that. Now what's really cool is what's in this jar, and that's actual rust, and this is pretty cool. I didn't come up with how you make it, but I definitely can swear by it. That's what it looks like inside, and I'll try and get that into focus. Looks pretty dirty and dingy, but right in the bottom corners there's a liquid, and the way you would build that is you mix some hydrogen peroxide with some distilled white vinegar, and then you'll take this steel wool, very very thin, you'll separate it, put it all in there, mix it all in, and there'll be a chemical reaction, and it'll speed up the rusting process of that steel wool. And because the steel wool is so thin, it breaks down pretty quickly. And this is probably the third or fourth mixture that I've made over the last maybe 12 months. And so you really start to get some good gunk at the bottom that you can muck around with and have some good fun. I'll keep the lid on that because it does smell. And as you can see, I just tapped the lid and that lid's fallen apart, so it definitely works. So I have a special brush. I wouldn't say special, but I have a brush that I only use for that rusting because I don't want to use it with paint. Some cards that I have handy just for when I'm wiping things with. But look, I'll get started now and show you what my process is. So I'll start with some engine grime, and this is really just a matte sort of grey. Give it a little bit of a shake, and that keeps the liquid on the bottom, and then I've got some less liquid paint stuck to the lid, and that's what I'll usually start with. Some people can call it, I think they call it dry brushing, similar sort of concept, right? And then what I'll do is create a build-up of grime where you think it naturally sits. So definitely around where the engine would be, and we'll probably put a couple of different layers of different colors on as we go, but just for the time being I'll go through a few of the areas pretty quick just so that you get an idea. Okay, so dab it on different places where you think grime would build up on an engine or on the bottom of a car. Right now I'm just doing some on the chassis itself. Okay. So while that's waiting, probably move on to the next part. And the great thing is now I've got only a tiny bit left on the edge of the brush, and this is where I like to put some effects like hand marks on the hood, right? And so there's just a little bit of paint left on that, and so what I can do is very lightly brush it in some areas on our virgin panel, and that's going to start creating a base for the weathering that we're going to do. Yeah. Okay. Now I'll try and keep the panels side by side so you can see as they build up what it looks like. Okay. We've also obviously got our the main part of the body, and again take advantage of that leftover grime color and put that on the paint. There's a lot of rust on this body that we built up in the previous episodes, so we don't want to go over those with the grime too much, because we're going to add some different effects to the rusted up areas itself. Just really want to make some dirty patches, some inconsistency, so it looks like the body's had a hard life. Yeah. A little bit more, and that's about it that's left on that brush. So that is the grime color. Now I'll switch over to using these weathering powders from Tamiya, these weathering masks. You get a few different sets of 3. Just out of interest, I have used some cheap ladies eyeshadow makeup in the past. It sometimes works, sometimes not so much. There's some reflective powders in there, and sometimes it doesn't give you the worn out look that you want, but you can buy those cheap application brushes from your $2 shop or whatever it is, because the Tamiya ones do tend to wear a fair bit. Now I use one side only for the rust color and one side only for the black color, that way it doesn't get mixed up. And I tend to start by getting plenty onto the brush, both sides, rust on one side, black on the other, and then I'll go up to my hood and I might add some black marks in some areas, maybe along that top edge. Alright, just to show that it's been maybe worked on. And then I'll flip it over. I've got that rust color, and I'll start to apply it in some of the areas. And what it does do is, where you've got little bits of red coming through the blue paint, if you apply it over there, it really starts to bring that rust color all the way through a lot stronger. Okay, we don't need to go over this main body with the rust, because we'll use some of that real rust to go through it, right? So you can see it's starting to build up some of that rough effects, right? Really, the good key, the good good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're building these rusty models is it's really about adding some layers. So just continually build up layers, and you start to get that real nice effect. Get a bit more rusty powder for this panel. A little bit on the bottom, some black in some corners, a bit more rust in some areas, right? And you start to get that, put a fair bit of rust actually on this on this edge here, because with the opening and closing of the door, might be some contact and chips away the paint and so on. Yeah. Inconsistent, no problems. And then on the top of the panel where we've got a whole bunch of this surface rust, we can add some black marks to a bit lightly in some areas, a bit heavier in other areas, and builds up that inconsistent layers. Yeah. Front corner where there's the headlight, I'll add a bit more. Okay, so that's adding a little bit of texture and inconsistency onto that panel now. Probably what I'll switch over to is that real rust, right? So there's a few ways you can do it, and it depends on the piece that you're working with. I'll just get that remnants of the lid out the way. Yeah. So down the bottom there's a liquid. You can pick up some of that, and if you hook your brush a little bit, you can pick up a chunk of rust. You can see that on the end of the brush. And then what I will do is I'll pick up the back of the pickup tray, and I'll deposit that chunk of rust into the corner. And I don't know if you can see it here, but if not, I'll get some zoomed in photos. But basically, I'll try and get that. A little bit difficult to see, but I've done it on the other side. I'll get some photos, but you end up leaving a chunk of rust deposit over there in the corner. It looks like a big piece of chunky rust. Yeah. Try and do some in this corner as well. And it looks a bit funny when you're doing it, but as it starts to dry, you really get a nice effect. Okay. Put some there next to that rust hole. A few others. A little bit random. Short brush, just to help you dab. Right, now, as I said, I've got these cards, and what I do with these cards is I'll build up a little bit of the liquid. Okay, and then I'll usually have a toothpick or a part of a piece of wood, like that, not very big. And that's what I'm actually going to use as a paintbrush. So I'll pick up some of the rust there, and then what I'll do with this panel is create some vertical lines. Yeah. And that starts to look like rust has been forming in some parts of the panel, and it's been dripping down over time. If you're not sure, check some reference videos or reference photos of real cars and how they rust. I've been fortunate enough to have lots of rusty cars, and so it gives me a pretty good idea. A few build up areas on the top. Okay, and then the other thing I'll do is I'll dip my brush into that pot again, and the actual rust holes that we've created, I'll just dab it a little bit there, and that will give it a few different types of rust colors on those textures, and as it dries, it'll give us that that look that we're going for, or that we achieved with the other panels. Yeah. So now you can start to see one is obviously still wet. You can see this is a panel that we started the session with already done, and then this is the one that we've just completed. And so that was obviously done a little bit more rushed. I'll go back and take my time a little bit more. Still got to wait for the rust to dry, but that's essentially where we're going with it, and that's on the panels. Now, if you've done some sign writing, that's where the sandpaper comes in, and you'll just start to sand some of those sections away, rough them up. Try not to smudge it, so wait for it to dry. But then you get a nice sort of worn out look in the background, and just adds good sort of character and layers onto your panel. Now, we did a little bit of painting of the grime colour on the chassis, and then what we would do after that is these MIG paints. They've got a fresh engine oil. This is actually pretty cool. It's a high gloss, transparent sort of colour, and when this dries, this actually looks exactly like oil. So just over that grey would have dried by now. I'm using a skewer to just add some of that paint on there, and I'll back all this up with some photos so you see what the finished results are like. But then we should start to see some colours there, yeah? Okay, you can see how it's starting to deposit in certain places, and that will look like oil. It really does look very, very close to what oil would look like, and you might want to add some focus areas where your oil sump plug would be. Yeah? Okay, so that's a quick walk through what I use, and at least get you to a very similar place, but really it's about building up your layers and having some fun with it. This part, to be honest, is the favourite part of the builds for me. So have as much fun as you want, and the good thing with things like this rust and the Tamiya powders is if you feel like you've not done it the way you want, use some water and that rust and those powders wash right off, and you start back to a nice clean slate, and you can start again. So good luck. I'll share some photos and see how we go. Enjoy.